From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Georgette Dorn, and I'm the Chief of the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress. It is a great pleasure to welcome Regina A, who is Distinguished Associate Professor of Modern Languages and Literatures, class of 1963, at the College of William and Mary, where she's been teaching since 2002. She is a graduate of the University of Iowa with a master's degree and a doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley. She has written on eco-fashion in Latin America. She's the editor of Latin American Fashion, a fashion reader, which won the 2005 award of the Arthur Whitaker Prize from the Mid-Atlantic Council of Latin American Studies. She is also past president of the Mid-Atlantic Council of Latin American Study, also known as MACLAS. She specializes in material and environmental culture in the Americas, has written many articles on fashion, dress, and body literature and body language. And now we welcome her to speak about her new book, Couture and Fashion in Argentina. Thank you.
Thank you for a very kind and generous introduction. It's an honor to be here and to talk with all of you today about an archival project long in the making. Every book is an incredible journey, or so the saying goes, and this one has certainly spanned years, continents, and cyberspace. There are so many people who deserve special mention: the colleagues and students with whom I have worked at the College of William and Mary, the Mid-Atlantic Council of Latin American Studies. I see many of its members here today, actually. The Latin American Studies Association, the Fulbright Commission of Argentina, and the Library of Congress, for all that this important division does, the Hispanic Reading Room, that is, for all that this important division does to foster innovation, facilitate interdisciplinary connections, and to inspire scholarly exchange. A special thanks to its director, Georgette Dorn, Reed Graham, Barbara Tenenbaum, and Catalina Gomez. Finally, thanks to all of you here today, as you are sure to inspire many future connections and conversations. Couture and Consensus analyzes a pivotal moment in Argentina. Couture and Consensus analyzes a pivotal moment in Argentina's nation-building project through the lens of fashion and politics. When one culls the archives for materials related to the nation-building process in Latin America, it quickly becomes clear that Benedict Anderson's theoretical outline of the nation as a limited, sovereign, and horizontal comradeship did not address sufficiently the tensions, in particular the sexual and racial exclusions, that linked future citizens of Spanish-American nation-states to a new historical consciousness. The so-called socialized image of a national community, as Antonio Cornejo Polar proposed in his analysis of founding fictions, often presented the terms of national identity without acknowledging the heterogeneous basis of the new nation. In most cases, post-colonial school textbooks projected, and I quote from one Argentine 19th century textbook, "the new world that Columbus gave us," unquote, thereby integrating the colonial past into a narrative of heroic deeds that promoted the values of a strong national identity based on the domination of others. Thomas C. Holt emphasizes that the nation was more than the creation of any one particular shared identity. It still remains part of a consensus-building process that is constantly reimagined. In terms of cultural production, a creative outlook emerged from the instability that accompanied revolution in 1810 and the independence process that followed. From these perspectives, Couture and Consensus argues that dress served as a critical expression of political agency and citizenship during the struggle to forge the Argentine nation. And I'm sorry that the slides aren't working today. I do have a few, and perhaps by the end we'll be able to go through them, but I do have one that would give you a sense of a dance celebrating cultural independence from Spain, a lithograph by Carlos Morel from 1845. My work today begins with the premise that fashion is often situated in discourses that circulate as a general social institution and that impact individuals and their communities. This is a somewhat fortunate circumstance in the context of postcolonial Argentina. Discursive and visual registers abound in the archives and inevitably shape our interpretations. Samples of cloth and garments simply do not always exist. For this reason, Argentine scholar Susana Saulkin asserts that it will never be possible to ascertain a full register of styles in Argentina. She points to the existence of only one 19th century dress in the collection of the Historical Museum of the city. This dress belonged to Remedios Escalada de San Martín, the wife of independent leader General José de San Martín, and was apparently the only garment in her possession that was not burned when she died. To construct a more comprehensive history of post-colonial material culture in Argentina, scholars must therefore rely upon the archives in order to reconstruct more fully the history of dress, of culture, and identity. As a profoundly social process, fashion invites individual and collective bodies to assume certain identities and at times to transgress its limits. Following the retreat of Spanish colonialism, unique fashions emerged to mark significant moments of political transition. In post-colonial Buenos Aires, fashion engaged a battlefield of signifiers. The dress of young patriots inspired to build a nation distanced political subjects from the relics of Spanish colonialism, a period when dress had served as a visual register that complemented the caste system and its notions of European privilege and construction of cultural, racial, and ethnic differences. Under the colonial system, Creole descendants of Europeans had been designated inferior social status, although some boldly appropriated subtle details in dress in order to imitate their Spanish superiors. As tensions mounted, Creoles moved to anti-Spanish styles that symbolized the legacy of liberty, equality, and fraternity espoused by the French Revolution and advocated a society based on merit rather than inherited privilege. Dress therefore represented emerging political interests that would play a significant role in shaping the future Argentine nation. In fact, fashion appears to have reflected uniquely national concerns long before any consolidation process had been enacted. And I do have a slide that I'll show you, also by Carlos Morel, of a painting of conflict, of civil war following independence. And you can see differences in dress reflected in this portrait. With independence, due to conflicting economic and political interests, the inhabitants of the River Plate region found themselves staunchly divided between two prominent political parties, the Unitarians and the Federals. The dress of these opposing political parties often reenacted foundational tensions between the customs of a so-called civilized few and the practices of a barbaric other. A dichotomy later analyzed with much fervor in the now classic Facundo, Civilización y Barbarie, Civilization and Barbarism, by Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, a 19th century statesman and future president who was forced to live in exile throughout this period. Led by the intellectual elite of Buenos Aires, the Unitarians were progressive, European-centered, and liberal. Noted for their tailored French suits, Unitarian colors incorporated light blue and white, reminders of the flag of independence from Spain, and much later, hues of green, which they would associate with the hope of Unitarian power in the future. From 1824 to 1827, the Unitarians had a brief stay in power under President Bernardino de Rivadavia, who established Buenos Aires. And I wonder, is this the technology we needed? Shall I pause briefly?
If you can.
if you don't mind, we'll have then images that I think when I analyze them, they'll come in handy. One moment, please, an intermission. Hold that thought. Where were we? I'll just quickly show you a few of the slides that you missed. Clearly, this is the cover of Couture and Consensus. This here is the lithograph by Carlos Morel that shows communities, a collective identity in formation. It's a dance following the retreat of Spanish colonialism. And this was actually very close to where we had left off by Carlos Morel as well from 1839, Carga de Caballería del Ejército Federal, the Confederate Army's cavalry in combat. And it shows the, perhaps we've lost a little bit of color with this slide, but the soldiers on horseback are Federals. They are wearing crimson colored clothing, and the ponchos have blue stripes, so they are most likely affiliated with Unitarians. It's hard to tell, though. I'll just go back a few sentences, so maybe when it's edited, we will not have me repeat twice. Thank you. All right, and thanks to everyone for your patience. So, led by the intellectual elite of Buenos Aires, the Unitarians were progressive, European-centered, and liberal. Noted for their tailored French suits, Unitarian colors incorporated light blue and white, the colors of the flag of independence from Spain, and much later, hues of green. From 1824 to 1827, the Unitarians had a brief stay in power under President Bernardino de Rivadavia, who established Buenos Aires as the capital of Argentina to overcome growing tensions over the annexation of territory in today's Uruguay. The provinces revolted, and civil strife quickly ensued outside Buenos Aires. In an attempt to install order, an interim government supported the rise to power of Federalist Juan Manuel de Rosas, who would rule an Argentine confederation from 1829 to 1852. Prilidiano Pueyrredón would paint his daughter Manuelita Rosas in 1851 towards the end of the regime. To the right are some insignias, and I guess their color is a bit lost in this slide, but the original shows a very deep crimson tone. Shortly after assuming power, Rosas legalized a civilian uniform in the province of Buenos Aires with severe penalties for those who did not follow such mandates. On February 3, 1832, a decree legalized crimson as the national color of faith in the Federation and obligated citizens to wear a crimson insignia. I am going to stop that. Sorry. Let me start over. On February 3, 1832, a decree legalized crimson as the national color of faith in the Federation and obligated citizens to wear a crimson insignia while about in public. Most immediately added crimson apparel, such as jackets, the chaleco, dresses, purses, and hair ribbons to their everyday wardrobe. Rosas himself crafted many of the standards for public and private appearances, and the words for street watchmen to cry out publicly on the hour, "Long live the Holy Confederation, death to the savage, unclean, loathsome Unitarians," even appeared on milliners' bills. In a violent push towards homogeneity, authorities of the Confederation prohibited light blue and green hues of Unitarian factions. Unsure of the hostile political climate, some men resorted to conveying opinions and political messages secretly, placing their ideas on round cards within their top hats, and so that they might extend them to one another when taking a salutatory bow. The regime sponsored didactic materials, popular poetry chapbooks, and public performances that associated Federalist men with healthy sideburns, like the ones used by Rosas, mustaches, and rurally inspired styles, while Unitarians were linked to U-beards, U-shaped for Unitarian, and European frock coats that signified in the regime's eyes, weakness and perversion. Police records reveal that any individual who dared transgress the federal dress code was promptly identified as a Unitarian, arrested, and sometimes killed. Uniform Consensus, the subject of my first chapter, analyzes how popular culture projected a unified federal family cloaked with the accessories of war and relied on stereotypes of male aggression and female passivity. Dress to Kill, the subject of Chapter 2, details active representations of women called on to participate in the war effort and whose significance in the nation-building process has often been overlooked. Many nameless women pieced together uniforms of coarse linen for the battlefield. In a few cases, they assumed the uniform themselves, and I did find several instances in which women were writing about these experiences. The Cuarteleras, an African Argentine woman fighting to help gain her freedom, although that would not be extended to her like it was to African Argentine males. Although the ideals of Republican motherhood afforded new roles to women, in particular the raising of future patriots, the idea of female political subjectivity threatened political hierarchies. A few periodicals reprimanded those male leaders whose vanity maintained the hierarchies of their Spanish predecessors. La Cotorra, a satirical magazine from the period, mocked men for relegating women to the domains of the home, even as their pronouncements seduced the public with words like liberty, equality, citizenship, and social rights, and constitutional unity. Its pages appropriated words circulating in post-colonial society and transformed each one into a series of nonsensical concepts, living up to its name, which La Cotorra means the parrot or chatterbox. Those words, like politica, politics, became as much Paco as polka. And so I'll give you their list of nonsensical concepts that come out of the words politics. Optica, palco, licito, paco, pica, taco, copa, alto, poca, plato, Hipólito, Pilato. Well, you get the message. These went on and on, these exercises, right? That the words, the concepts of independence had been nonsensical if they didn't include women in their future. La Cotorra asked women to turn their beauty against men, transforming common fashion accessories into powerful weapons and strategies. A poem written by Petra Pio Pito de Carriquiri y Sepúlveda, which I imagine is a pseudonym, asked men to renounce their power and avert a women's revolt. Scholars will find this poem unfamiliar, and so I have reproduced it entirely in the book. Here are a few excerpts translated into English. How well we know those tyrants who belittle the female sex. What have they done with the destiny of the universe in all this time? Let us revolt already. It's easy to change the commonplace parasol into a cruel saber, the frivolous distaff into a sharp lance, the mantilla into a steel helmet. Ugly sex, respond. What great sin did we commit to cause you to deny us a post in the state as if we didn't have a brain? Without representation in the Senate, without representation in the Congress, we see that you are messing up the world all by yourselves without listening to us as we cackle and fly about. You'll hear us nonetheless, women who, united together with strong bonds, have views or looks that are not useless, and which words and deeds will prove from this day forward their duties entail the final conquest of their rights. The March of the Skirted Citizen, as they called themselves, belonged to the woman whose desire to participate in the public arena far outweighed her interest in prevailing notions of beauty, fashion, and social obligation. Fashion was about progress, juxtaposing the body at rest with its movement through public spaces. As male leaders set out to arrange political hierarchies, they found their very spaces obstructed by groups of women wearing elaborate headdresses. The topic of fashion as presence, or Chapter 3. The fad for audacious combs had begun in the 1820s when women of the region began to discard Spanish customs for other styles. derived from peine, which means comb in Spanish, and later peineta, a convex comb worn in the hair, the peineton might translate into English as something more elaborate than a grandiose comb. Even the word in Spanish is pronounced as if it were a statement, peineton. At the cusp of its popularity during the early years of the Rosas regime, the peineton measured 1 yard in height and width. With a corseted waist, Elizabethan-style collar, and mutton sleeves, the fashionable woman of Buenos Aires already commanded attention. One fashion lithograph reveals a model in a, and I'm going to go back, pardon me. One fashion lithograph reveals a model in a glamorous crimson dress with rose embellishments to convey support for rosas, which can also mean roses in Spanish, and she is the one who is on the right. Clearly there are roses woven into her peineton, embroidered on the front of her dress, and you see the crimson ribbons that also adorn her. Ribbons were considered an incredibly luxurious item at the time. To carry the immense tortoiseshell peineton, which had 6 to 14 teeth and weighed about 800 grams, women often wove their hair into a French-style chignon with the help of concoctions made of ingredients like honey, eggs, and hemp seed oil. In diaries and magazine columns, women took great pride in working with artisans to design elaborate motifs for their unique combs. Some artists integrated patriotic slogans into the comb's ample span, such as "Long live the Argentine Confederation" and "Confederation or Death." From an advertisement in one of the period's newspapers, the British Packet, we know that a few incorporated the portrait of Rosas into the design, and you can also see Federación o Muerte is actually circling that image of Rosas as well. Yet other women preferred a more neutral pattern for their comb, opting instead to waft a politically inspired fan or don gloves with Rosas's portrait so that guests could at once kiss their hands and the image of the federal leader. While portraits from the period have tended to immortalize elite women of the region, there's evidence to suggest that women of all social classes enjoyed this fashionable pursuit. An early lithograph by César Hipólito Bacle depicts, and here it's on the left, the female figure, an African-Argentine woman. César Hipólito Bacle depicts an African-Argentine woman wearing a peineton as she makes her way by the corner pulperia, a popular marketplace. The female protagonists of La Gaucha, a popular gazette by Luis Pérez that circulated widely throughout the River Plate region, discuss in verse the pride felt in making patriotic statements through dress. In fact, the peineton had become so popular that it eventually was used, and I quote the British Packet, as a new figure of speech to designate the ladies, unquote. Reporters soon commented on the number of combs rather than women observed at political events when registering who was present. As a symbol of the powers of female persuasion, the comb appeared to, quite literally, destabilize and sometimes shift the direction of men. The editor of La Argentina, a periodical, proposed that a woman should use her peineton to pacify men by ushering them back into the home and away from the war-torn countryside. Nevertheless, several letters to the editor in this magazine and the official press denounced the vanity of those who continue to weave their hair around an inordinate comb. And I quote one military official, "Let us defend ourselves from these female tyrants because their despotism is intolerable and they will always obtain all that they want through infinite ways," unquote. With allusions to battle and invading females, this is quite a common theme in periodicals of the period. This military official is not alone. Many implored women to desert their combs and regroup within the domestic sphere. Under the title of Extravagancias de 1834, translated as Extravagances of 1834, César Hipólito Bacle, a French artist, satirized what many perceived as the absurdity of female agency in the public domain, portraying women as unpredictable, destabilizing forces. Bacle had moved to Argentina from France with the intention of publishing a joint European and Latin American fashion newspaper, Diario de la Moda, but this project never materialized. He turned to fashion lithography instead. He holds an important place in Argentina's history as the nation's founding lithographer and as the director of the government regime-sponsored Imprenta del Comercio. The press, which dates to January of 1835, published bulletins, federal insignias, and official portraits of Rosas. In order to phase out the excessive combs that had once represented patriotically inspired women, the Imprenta del Comercio published a series of poems equating the women who wore peinetones to Unitarian supporters and even prostitutes. And there are several popular poems that I've published, reproduced in the book that gives you a sense of how degrading such representations were. The peineton underwent a catachresis and became a metonym for the word prostitute. So the peineton, the comb, becomes a politically inspired, active female subject, and then the Imprenta del Comercio is, in the end, ushering it out with this shift. The lithographs from the extravagances of 1834 allowed for many ambiguous readings, and I would like to share just a few with you. Spatially speaking, these images depict women who destabilize their surroundings and men who find themselves obstructed by the presence of women who follow their fashion desires. The series begins with a woman who emerges from the home elaborately dressed for a walk in the street. Peineton at Home depicts a woman who has hired a day laborer to unhinge the front doors and dismantle the facade of her family's house. Seemingly unaware of the disaster she sows, this home wrecker urges him to finish the task at all costs. The archives reveal that most fashion columns emphasized what female victims could do to protect themselves from comb-snatching delinquents. The regime-sponsored series, on the other hand, emphasized the domination of men by comb-wearing women. In Peinetones en el Teatro, Peinetones in the Theater, the men who kindly accompany fashionable ladies to their theater balconies humbly remove their top hats and are reduced to figures who must squint through the tiny decorative holes of the women's combs. Based on the European-style clothing and lack of crimson insignia, one could ask if the women present have associated themselves with Unitarian men, a visual cue that surely added tension to this public spectacle. Although some men have brought along opera glasses and spectacles, as you can see, the devices are ultimately rendered useless. The combs impose their own views, and the men will be forced to piece together the fragments of the evening. On the floor of the theater, in contrast, a sexually segregated crowd of men stands proudly with their top hats in place. They await the upcoming spectacle with lively conversation. In Peinetones in the Street, the final lithograph of the series, a woman's towering comb links the sight of something to the terror of castration, with effects not unlike those produced by the snakes on Medusa's head. As women's combs take to downtown Buenos Aires, one man swears out of desperation, "Damn the peinetones, malditos sean los peinetones." His exclamation responds to the exaggerated proportions and oblique angles of the headdress that has invaded city sidewalks. Having successfully generated her own expanse in the public arena, the one woman parades down the middle of the street and right through two men. She injures one in the groin and permanently maims the other, who cries, "Ouch, for she has gouged my eye." The enlarged crests of women overpower the top hats of men. With a confident stride, the woman at center responds in a demanding tone, "Disperse yourselves, gentlemen." In postcolonial Argentina, the notion of a female-dominated public arena remained an option suitable only for satirical caricatures and burlesque commentary. While women's fashions like the peineton had once been emphasized for their unique and patriotic character, the tensions over women's roles in the political realm and the negative representations prominent in the press and the visual arts ultimately led to their demise. Shattering expectations, the emblematic peineton called into question the exclusivity of male participation in the public sphere by allowing women to improvise their citizenship individually and collaboratively. In the chapters that follow in this book, Fashion Writing and Searching for Female Emancipation, I reveal several other cases in which fashion also served as a tool for political resistance. In today's Argentina, allusions to the peineton and other fragments of postcolonial dress often evoke the charged legacies of authoritarianism. The introduction and epilogue that frame Couture and Consensus reveal how discordant fragments continue to disrupt political agendas and plot alternatives. I would like to conclude by sharing two compelling examples from among the many visual artists, authors, designers, and activists whose creative practices I discuss in the book. During the transition to democracy in Argentina, artist Maria Silvia Corcuera Terán challenged the politics of seduction that came to characterize the neoliberal period when she began to incorporate the peineton in her work. In the 1990s, at a time when magazines like Gente and Caras, People and Faces showcased the exuberant lifestyles of the rich and famous, Corcuera Terán deliberately used this icon of resistance from the past to expose the nation's dead, its migrations, and its unresolved conflicts. Her 1998 exhibition, entitled Voluntad de Desmesura, Desire for Excess, presented blindfolded female subjects embedded within the frames of combs with nail-like teeth. Ponételo. Te duele a ti, me duele a mí. Si yo me siento herida, vos también. Put it on. It hurts you, and it hurts me. If I feel pain, so do you, the artist would later explain, begging the viewer to take on the wounds of Argentina's past, in particular the plight of the disappeared and the collective pain of human rights abuses and violations from the dirty war between 1976 and 1983 that targeted its own citizens. The disappeared refer to the 30,000 people who the military regime labeled as subversives, had kidnapped, and then executed, with little to no details left behind of their whereabouts. And here we have the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, de la Línea Fundadora, who very much inspired some of these works by Corcuera Terán. This one in particular, which looks like the shawl worn by the mothers. Fashioning her works from paper, wood, string, rusted nails, and other found materials, Corcuera Terán located the politics of memory in the peineton and began to register artistically the dynamics of active memory, collective identity, and everyday life in her native Buenos Aires. At a time when Argentines began to reassess the fracturing of memory that has made up the process of national reconstitution, as Luis Ronegger argues, the creative arts have appropriated the historical vocabulary of color and fashion to reformulate the tenets of collective identity. Some of Corcuera Terán's recent works, for example, integrate vivid colors, some 40 hues of red, in the case of one sculpture, that would seem to refer to the foundational tensions on which Argentine collective identity rests. In La Argentina de Pedazos, Argentina in Pieces, the comic art of Enrique Breccia represents the violence of tyranny through the visual portrayal of a gentleman in European styles overtaken by crimson-clad gauchos. Ricardo Piglia, who compiled the artwork for this particular volume depicting Argentine literary classics in 1993, began the work with Breccia's graphic rearticulation of Esteban Echeverria's The Slaughterhouse, a haunting tale of violence and torture set in the Rosas period. In this artistic rendering, Breccia uses black ink and a combination of thin and choppy lines to narrate the civil conflicts of an emerging Argentina. The artist presents the butchers in uniforms, whereas he outlines the Unitarian as if to indicate a hollow figure objectified by the degrading slurs of onlookers. One finds the force of color only in the words used by a crowd that manifests its support of authoritarianism, fashion ultimately becoming like the kind of defiant statement made by those protesting the dictatorships in the 1970s and 1980s, when men risked long hair and women short skirts in order to defy prevailing dress codes. This contemporary vision of the slaughterhouse, in which the victim's traces are sketched with lines and somber shadows, presents a kind of colorless epitaph that not unlike those black and white photographs that the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo have traditionally carried to commemorate their loved sons and daughters and grandchildren who disappeared at the hands of repressive regimes. Through an exploration of dress, subjectivity, and difference, Breccia remembers. Negotiating the promise of the future while facing the memory of dictatorship, artists like Maria Silvia Corcuera Terán and Enrique Breccia map the nation's political tensions onto its dress and material culture. Inviting all to engage this interpretive work, Couture and Consensus concludes with the image on the left of a sculpture of an inverted crimson peineton by Corcuera Terán. It's entitled The Supplicant. The Supplicant depicts a trough like those used in the north of Argentina to grind grains for popular foods or wash clothing. It also represents the totem-like towers of the city of Buenos Aires. Here, Corcuera Terán turns history on its head and emphasizes the migrations on which urban life rests. As a creative endeavor, worn collectively in the post-colonial moment, the peineton called into question those political interests that did not bear in mind equity for all citizens. The rhetoric of fashion disrupted authoritarian practices that limited the participation of certain segments of the population. The potential for fashion to inspire creative agency continues to inspire many contemporary artists, authors, and designers alike. The symbols of political consciousness in Argentina, whether a peineton, a crimson-coated poncho, or the white shawl, continue to extend the symbolic dimensions of representation and reverberate with new messages and meanings. As scholars return to the archives and unravel the political dimensions of dress, the terms of Couture and Consensus promise to shed light on the often overlooked and truly dynamic facets of Argentine cultural history. May we one day know the whole story. Thank you. Thank you.
You can have a couple of
Absolutely. And is it possible to move as I field questions? Yes? Okay, great.
no, actually no, because there was this.
Okay. I will stay behind the podium then.
Please state your name.
Yes.
Thank you for a great presentation, very entertaining and
Thank you.
informational. I'm wondering about your archival work, where you found the images and how you went about trying to recreate this visual imaginary or not so imaginary of Argentina history.
A lot of the work began at the Biblioteca Nacional in the Sala de Reservados, the special collections room. And at the time, the library had just moved from one building to the next. And so there were these moments where scholars would open one magazine and find another. And so there were some real adventures, and there was detective work that went into this. I truly went to every single museum in the city of Buenos Aires and really sought out where, first I was looking for clothing and then realized that examples did not abound. And then came across some collections of the peineton in the Museo Fernández Isaac Blanco, Saavedra Museum. It was just a very inspiring place, and at every point, the librarians, the museum staff would just invite me to hold the peineton and take the beautiful manuscript and photocopy it. And to be honest, I was very scholarly about this and had some ethical dilemmas. No, I can't go photocopy that. It will fall apart. Since then, since the 1990s when I began this project and the search for those materials, things have been put on, first they were put on microfilm, now there's a digital world that just truly did not exist. And so I have found that over the years, the Argentine government, Ministerio de Cultura, there have been educational sites added that truly, bring to light many of these holdings, which is a wonderful thing in terms of access and, and as a professor to be able to teach that at the College of William and Mary, to go to some of these sites. But initially it was about, I need police records, I need to find out what's happening, I need to go to the police museum, or, the Library of Congress in Buenos Aires because of some 19th century document. So it was a process that, because I was living there with a Fulbright scholarship, that I could be in the archives for about 2 years looking for this. So, yes, but I should say that many of the peinetones were destroyed in a bombing of the AMIA, the Jewish Center, which was near the museum, and so many were lost at that time. And the collection that is the most prominent, and I think the one that is most permanently on display, is the one at the Saavedra Museum.
I think one more question. Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering, the pantalones are obviously the most compelling, arresting element, and it's like, I say to my students, you can't make this stuff up. Like,
It's
when
true.
you find a load of stuff like that, it just plays right into the thing that you're trying to do. And I like the way you began a comparison with the public presentation of the madres with the opposite kind of very, very simple sort of headwear. So I'm sort of wondering, in addition to what you found in these magazines, is there any clear link between not just physical presence in the public sphere, but political activism by women who talk about the pantalones specifically?
Absolutely, and I should have chapter 4, which I didn't really delve into in this particular presentation, is called Fashion Writing. And the fashion periodicals from the Rosas period were extremely revolutionary. They were importing the ideals of the French Revolution from France. A lot of the young generation of intellectuals, future statesmen like Sarmiento, Juan Bautista Alberdi, the author of the first Constitution, were writing with female pseudonyms about fashion. And they were writing about things like moderately walking shoes or democratic hairstyles. I have no idea what those look like. They didn't provide images, but one can get the picture. And for for several issues, under a year, I think no one censored these with as careful of an eye, because people assumed that women were writing, or that fashion was frivolous and therefore not overtly political or not political. And what happens is, many of the writers from this young generation, Esteban Echeverría, Sarmiento, Alberdi, end up in exile. But following Rosas's defeat, the Battle of Caseros, which ends the regime in 1852, you have women writers beginning more fashion magazines. I mean, some magazines had begun with women editors behind them, like La Aljaba, La Camelia, but truly it's in that post-Rosas period that women start to use female pseudonyms, write about politics, emancipation, justice, education, and everyone assumes that men are writing this. And it's a great debate. They love it. It's in all of the newspapers. And, is it a man writing? Is it a woman writing? So there's this masquerade, and it's the fashion column that ultimately allows women, I think, a very important forum. Granted, it's problematic. It's a limited control, right, of perception, of gender perception. But it really initiates a long-standing tradition of women's periodicals writing about feminism, writing about political issues in the 19th century. So it's wonderful, and there are more than penetones. I mean, there were many debates about virtue, about modesty, about vanity, what was political vanity. There were fashions that Federalist women wore that I didn't discuss that included ribbons, and since ribbons were such a luxury item, people traded them. They had popular songs about them, and so women did. I think from the representation in this popular poetry, you did get the sense that women were included in this political endeavor of the regime. But there is, of course, a problem there too, a contradiction in that their voices are being appropriated in the realm of popular poetry. But it's an exciting moment, and one fraught with contradictions, and fashion writing, that chapter truly does delve much more into that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.